All right. Well, welcome. I'm really happy to be here today for what promises to be a fascinating discussion. My name is Daniel Maines. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and African studies at the University of Oklahoma. And the discussion today is sponsored by the Center for Peace and Development and the Security in Context Network. And I'm really pleased to be joined today by Dr. Adem Abebe, who is the program officer at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance in the Netherlands, where he manages ConstitutionNet. And he has published regularly in Foreign Policy and Al Jazeera, among other publications. And his work explores issues related to democracy, conflict, and constitutional reform, particularly in East Africa. Dr. Adem Abebe holds a Ph.D. from the University of Pretoria. Prior to his current position, he's also been a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law. And I've invited him here just because I'm really impressed by some of his public work as a public intellectual that he's done around the civil war in Ethiopia. And we'll be talking about the roots of the civil war, as well as his blueprint for bringing peace to the region. So again, really welcome today. Really looking forward to this discussion. And yes, Dr. Adem Abebe, if you could just please maybe get us started by just telling for an audience that I'm guessing that some of the audience will be very familiar with this war, others it may be new to them. So if you could just tell us a little bit about what's happening in Ethiopia, what's been happening in the past couple of years, and what you see as some of the primary factors behind the roots of the civil war. I would really appreciate that.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So we are obviously talking about a conflict that is now already 15 months long. It started in November 2020 when fighters affiliated with the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was a dominant political force in the past 3 decades in Ethiopian politics, attacked the northern command of the Ethiopian Federal Army. Now, if in terms of looking at the roots of it, it started initially as a power struggle. So Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, and he came to power on the backs of popular protests. And the elements within the ruling coalition at that time, which was called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which was led by the TPLF, then the internal parties, the members of the coalition used the popular anger, the popular protests to force a reshuffle in power within the party. And that reshuffle then led to the prominence of the Oromo the Oromo branch of the ruling party. And Abiy Ahmed was central to that branch. And so the difference already started during the protests because the coalition within the ruling party fractured because elements within the ruling coalition were trying to use the popular protests to ride on them to force a reshuffle, which they succeeded in. And the TPLF obviously in the end accepted that a reshuffle was necessary, but they had preferences. They particularly did not want Abiy Ahmed to be the prime minister. But in the end, a coalition between the Amhara and the Oromo branch of the ruling party. And these two parties represent, or at least they come from the groups that represent together about 2/3 of the population of the country. And so when Abiy Ahmed came to power, he came to power after a crack within the ruling coalition, and after the TPLF at the time resisted his rise to power. So already at the time Abiy Ahmed came to power, there were differences between the TPLF and Abiy, the person, and the parties that he represented. And so these differences then obviously escalated because Abiy Ahmed started to assert his power as prime minister. And that meant that he had to take control of political power. He had to take control of security power. And that because at that particular time, most of the security power, most of the political power was in the hands of the TPLF, he was essentially taking it from them. And so there were already differences, and then the measures that he took subsequently to claim the power that came with his position obviously created even more rift with the TPLF. And so that difference essentially continued, and there were other additional issues that created even more problems. First one was that the Amhara branch of the ruling party at the time was using contestations over land. What is, the Tigrayans consider it as Western Tigray, the Amharas consider it as Walka Tagari. This is an area of land that borders Sudan. And so, there were already difference, and then these contestations over land added fuel, and of course the peace process with Eritrea, and the fact that the Tigrayans felt that they were sidelined in that process, particularly because Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, did not find it appropriate to directly talk with the TPLF. So he wanted to engage directly with Abiy Ahmed. And so, you had the land issue with Amhara, the peace process, and the history of conflict and disagreements between the Eritrean government and the TPLF. And then ultimately, when Abiy Ahmed pushed forward with replacing what was a coalition of ethnic-based parties into a national party, a prosperity party. He replaced the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front with a prosperity party, which is an individual membership-based party, which meant that the Tigrayans then decided that they didn't want to be part of it. One, because it reduced the representation, the voice that the TPLF had, and secondly, they also felt that ideologically, it did not consider ethnicity as the foundation of politics. So there was the issue of representation, because it cut down. The TPLF in the former coalition had a quarter of the positions, despite being a small group within the coalition. And now with the new party formed, there was no representation as such for ethnic parties. There was only a representation for individuals. And in combination with the ideology, what was considered as ideological differences, it even widened the rifts. And so essentially, you had a coalition that was fractured, the difference already set, and then there were other issues that came on top of that subsequently after Abiy Ahmed came to power that widened the rift. And perhaps, in my opinion, the last straw was the postponement of the elections as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the TPLF in particular felt that the postponement of the elections was not necessary, that COVID was being used as a justification by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and his newly formed prosperity as a reason to take time to organize, build themselves, essentially enhance their chance of success in the elections. And so the Tigrayans then rejected the process of constitutional interpretation that ultimately led to a decision, at least formally, to postpone the elections. And so what they did was they organized their own elections. And after organizing the elections, they rejected the legitimacy of the federal government. And the federal government then suspended the subsidies that it normally provides to Tigray, and instead decided to direct it through local governments. And essentially, within a month or so, within 2 months of these incidents, the escalations continued. And at the beginning of November, the first shots were fired by the Tigrayan fighters. They taught, and they said that it was a preemptive attack. It was a preemptive self-defense. But the Ethiopian government said they had no plans to attack, and that they were forced into this particular war. So if I can, briefly summarize it, there were popular protests, and that there were members in the ruling coalition that rode on those popular protests to then gain the upper hand within the ruling coalition, which meant that the coalition fractured. And the TPLF, which was dominant at the time, did not want Abiy Ahmed to come to power, but in the end, Abiy Ahmed came to power. And then a number of issues that happened subsequently widened the rifts. And ultimately, the contestation over the elections led to mutual delegitimization, de-recognition of each other, and ultimately military confrontation.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that very comprehensive and extremely clear explanation of what has been a very complex series of events. Let me ask you one kind of follow-up question about that, just on kind of the roots of the conflict. I mean, you've described it, I think, accurately and nicely in very political terms. You know, there's this fracturing of a coalition. There's feelings of being isolated from that new party. There's sort of the lack of a holistic political party that incorporates the TPLF. There's others that have argued that this is not just an issue of politics, not just an issue of regional autonomy, but this is also about economic power. I mean, the federal government in Ethiopia has, particularly under the EPRDF, which was, for those who don't know, was definitely dominated by the TPLF, controlled massive amounts of natural resources, controlled state-owned companies, for example, sugar being just one example. A lot of economics and economic power went through the federal government. I mean, what do you think about that argument? To what degree is this a conflict that's about economic power, and or the balance between economics and politics, and trying to explain the roots of the war?
Well, I mean, it certainly played a role. So the TPLF was using its dominance of political center, its dominance of the security architecture to also dominate the economy. And their fear naturally was that if they were losing control of the political power in the center, if they were losing control of the security power, and that was happening because Abiy was asserting that power, there was concern that over time, they will then lose their economic dominance as well. And in particular, because Ethiopia's economy in the past 10, 15 years, the best years of the Ethiopian economy were led by the state. It was largely the result of public investment in infrastructure and other things. And so political power, had direct implication on who benefited from the economic windfalls in the country. And so, there was no immediate threat as such to their economic dominance, but ultimately that was where things were headed to. In particular, because the state continues to be the biggest investor. So now that there's a new, there's new faces in the centers of power, the allocations of economic resources, economic rents from the state would have changed, right? The direction would have changed. And so, as they say, it's the economy ultimately. But I think it was too early, so it didn't get there. It was fundamentally first a power struggle in the center, because Abiy as prime minister had to claim both political and security power, and the TPLF considered that over time they may not only lose their power in the center, but they may even lose their power in the regions. And because of Ethiopian history, whoever controls the center often has a big say in terms of who leads at the regional level. So essentially, they considered that the countdown to their loss of power, even at the regional level, had started. So you're right. Economics was always it was always an underlying issue. But this conflict was really about political power and security power, which obviously in the Ethiopian context often came with economic dominance.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think if I understand correctly, you're saying that down the road, economics, control over rents, these issues would have become extremely important, but it really hadn't even gotten to the point where that economic power had been transferred yet. And I like your point that you made about infrastructure. I mean, that's an area where I've studied, and just, Ethiopia has one of the highest rates of public investment in infrastructure in the world. And so we're talking about billions of dollars of contracts in roads, hydroelectric dams. And so the power of the federal government to give out those contracts is great and comes with a lot of benefits that come with that. But I think if I understand correctly, you're saying that that certainly was probably a worry of political leaders, but it wasn't happening yet in terms of that transfer of control because it was so recent under Abiy and the Prosperity Party.
That's right. So it was, obviously, as I said, because they are connected and because the state is the main source of resources, it would have come. And in fact, if you look at what happened after the war started, and particularly after the TPLF was designated as a terrorist organization, the first thing they did was capture the big companies that were running the Ethiopian economy. So all of them are now under federal management. And of course, also because some of the key public institutions, public entities, for instance, METEC, the Metal and Engineering Corporation, were led by Tigrayans, and a lot of resources came with that, and they took over that. Also, a lot of the public sugar companies, they were also, the government also took control of them and changed the management and all. And so there was already, they could feel that the change in political power, the change in security power was coming with a fundamental shift in terms of who controls the distribution of rents. And obviously, because there's now, there's a new force, the Tigrayans would have been perhaps not on top of the list as they used to get. And also even private entities, there was a lot of private leaders and some of the companies that were headed by Tigrayans now have been clipped to size, and some of them have even gone bankrupt. So the economy is indeed important, but at the time the conflict erupted, it was perhaps in anticipation, and I think fundamentally it was really about first losing, at the center political and security power, and then also genuine concerns from the TPLF that ultimately their power, even at the regional level, may be in danger. So they knew that if you lose control of the center, you become vulnerable, and therefore they wanted to maintain some kind of control at the center.
Yeah, okay, that's a great explanation. So you've taken us through some of the roots of the conflict, or the origins. Can you give us a sense, particularly for those who maybe haven't been following this as closely, just about once the war begins, just the scale of the war, and kind of briefly bring us up to the present, just in terms of what's happening with the major events in the war and why this has been so important for the region and the globe more broadly?
Was a massive war. I think there hasn't been such a big civil war in Africa in the last decade or so, maybe even more. And because we had a Tigrayan army, it was a genuinely large army composed of generals that have led the Ethiopian army for decades, and that had also experienced prior to that. And you also have an Ethiopian army also large, with relatively modern armory, and so it was a big war. It was a massive war, and at the beginning, the Ethiopian army, because the Northern Command was the center of the national army, it had more than 70% of the big, the main armory of the Ethiopian government. And therefore, when they attacked the Northern Command, they not only neutralized the personnel, but they also took control of a large arsenal of the armory of the Ethiopian government. And therefore it added, looking at their experience, looking at the size of the Tigrayans that were part of the Northern Command, and also the special force that they had trained. If you look at all of that, it was a massive war. And it was quite a surprise, actually, that they were defeated in the beginning within a couple of weeks. But it was always clear that they had the capacity to mount a comeback, and that's what they did. After 6 or 7 months of federal control of Tigray, in the end, they managed to recover and control Tigray, and even invade large parts of Amhara and large parts of Afar. And so this was a massive war, and I think the attention that it drew was legitimate. And of course, like all wars, you have reasons to start it. As we tried to explain that there was an element of power struggle, an element of mistrust and conflict that was already brewing. But war also creates its own grievances. And so when the war was in Tigray, there was a lot of allegations of massacres by the Ethiopian Federal Force, by Eritrean forces that joined the federal government, and also Amhara forces that took control of areas that they have always claimed, but were under Tigray in the past three decades. And therefore, it has created now new grievances of massacres, of even claims of genocide from Tigrayans. And so you have all those reasons that the war started about, but now there's also an element of justice, an element of reconstruction that also has to be handled. And so essentially the most of the war was in Tigray until June, and then from June onwards, the war became in Afar and Amhara, and I think until essentially for a year, until December, the Tigrayans were still in Amhara, and then in late November, early December, there was a federal offensive that pushed them back to Tigray again. So at the moment, the way the things are that the federal government and its allied forces have pushed the Tigrayan force back to what is considered proper Tigray, and there are aerial attacks, and there are some border skirmishes, including the TPLF attacking parts, particularly and quite interestingly, parts of Afar, where humanitarian provisions normally go through Tigray. But at the moment, the federal government has decided that they're going to stay. They are not going to enter proper Tigray, and they are essentially following. They have encircled it, and there's a lot of limitations on access to humanitarian provisions, and of course other kinds of access, including for the media. But overall, so you have all the grievances that led to the war. But the war has also created new grievances, particularly of destruction, of massacres, the first few months in Tigray, and then subsequently in Amhara and in Afar. So the issue of justice, of reconstruction of what has been lost, is also fundamental of course, also reconciliation. There was always tension between the Amhara and Tigray region, and perhaps much less between Afar and Tigray region. But now, because they have gone through war, the tensions have exacerbated, and so you're going to need social and political reconciliation to address them as well. So it's not just ideological differences, it's not just economic interest, political power struggle, and now it's also about justice, and it's also about reconciliation. It's also about rebuilding what has been destroyed. So the way to peace is going to be extremely complicated.
Yeah. And that's, I think, one thing I appreciate about your work is that you have not only described the roots of the war, but you've also written about blueprints for peace, possibilities for peace that address the issues that you're talking about, of not only the political roots of the problem, but what's happened during the war, and issues of justice, issues of kind of bringing people back together and trying to solve some of these fundamental problems. So I was wondering if maybe that's what we can get into next. I know it's incredibly complicated, but if you could just outline some of what you see as the major things that need to happen in order to reach a lasting peace, both in terms of some of these political issues, but then what you were talking about in terms of justice after the violence, and especially since that violence has spread well beyond armed combatants to incorporate so many civilians have been impacted by this violence in particular.
So there are two things. First is a peace process. So we have to obviously silence the guns and then find the solution to the war itself. So solving the peace is one, and then the second larger, broader issue, and that is answering fundamental questions about Ethiopian history, and based on that history, the kind of structure, the kind of state that Ethiopia should become. Now, the first one primarily involves the federal government, Amhara region, and Afar and Tigray, and of course, Eritrea also has a lot of interest in what is happening. And in terms of bringing an end to this conflict, obviously, things would have been much better before the war had started, if they had sat down and in good faith try to understand the genuine fears and concerns of the other and finding solutions. But unfortunately, we had to go through all this destruction and war to ultimately get back to the same stage where either we have to talk to each other or we have to continue fighting. And I think at the moment, there is a realization that either side, none of the sides is going to get what it wants by pursuing war, which is a good sign. But I think there's still lack of clarity in terms of how they want to pursue peace, especially at the federal level, where there's several actors, several interests, and particularly because Amhara and Afar region feel like they have to take the risk. So if peace comes, the entire country will benefit. But if peace collapses and conflict erupts again, most of the risk is actually on Afar and Amhara regions. So there's a lot of genuine fear from Afar and Amhara in terms of how this should go. But ultimately, we have to, first it's a psychological thing. I think there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of anger. There is a tendency to see that the other side, is not just bad, that they are evil, right? So first we have to have that mental shift, and I think once that is done, then we can look at the issues. So at the moment, the Tigrayans have two fundamental issues, and Amhara as well. One is the issue of what the Tigrayans consider is Western Tigray and what the Amharas consider is Walqat and Tagare. So this is a land issue. It's also an identity issue because both Tigrayans and Amharas live in those areas, and so there has to be a solution. We have to find a solution to that land contestation. And my suggestion is that I think if we think only in terms of language and all, I think both sides have a plausible case. So they cannot dismiss. One cannot dismiss the other's cause as ridiculous, right? And so there has to be a way of recognition that each side has plausible cases, and they both have to sit down, try and find a political solution. And unfortunately, the Ethiopian constitution also provides that whenever there are disputes over territory, the first resort is negotiation and compromise. And if the two regions can find an agreeable way forward, then that is endorsed. And if that doesn't work, then it goes to the House of Federation, which often resorts to referendum. But that is very difficult because the demographics has changed historically. And so if you want to consider, who has a majority or not, that would change depending on what particular time in history you consider. And so ultimately there has to be a political solution, and that political solution could potentially include a possible autonomy for that particular part, rather than making it part of Amhara or Afar of Tigray. It could become a province or a region on its own. But ultimately, this is something that they have to go through, sit down, and find an agreeable way forward. So that's one of the issues. And the second one, I think it's more significant and affects all countries, is what kind of state, what kind of representation Tigrayans should have at the national level, and also what kind of autonomy should Tigray have as a region. And this affects the whole country because whatever kind of representation Tigray will have, other regions will demand as well. And whatever kind of autonomy Tigray seeks to have, other regions would want that as well. And so this is a national matter, and it would have to be solved through a national dialogue, because unfortunately, so far, we've had several transition moments, but the dominant force of the time always carved out their dreams, their imaginations as an Ethiopian dream, as an Ethiopian imagination. And therefore, we never really had a chance to sit and negotiate at the country level. So there are differences, not just at the elite level, but at the social level in terms of what kind of country Ethiopia was and what kind of country Ethiopia should become and what kind of institutional architecture should be built on based on that understanding. And so that requires national national dialogue. And of course, if the national dialogue is going to succeed, Tigrayans should also be represented. And therefore, having peace, including potentially finding a solution to the land contestations between Amhara and Tigray, are critical. So basically, there is a peace process to stop the guns, find a modicum of peace to solve the problems at the moment. But the bigger issues about the nature of state that are central to the dispute will require national dialogue, national engagement across the country to find an agreeable solution to.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get into some of these bigger issues in this national dialogue that you're talking about. But before we get to that, I mean, one of the basic challenges for that first step in the peace process is that the TPLF, the political organization currently representing the Tigray region, is classified by the federal government in Ethiopia as a terrorist organization. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia can't really negotiate with a terrorist organization if they're classified as such. Also, a major challenge is that among, I would say, the majority of the population in Ethiopia outside of the Tigray region has a fairly negative, and you can disagree if you want, but I would argue a fairly negative perception of the TPLF as well at this point. How can Abiy Ahmed negotiate, one, with a terrorist organization, number two, with an organization that is seen in such a negative light by so much of the population, where I'm guessing there's going to be significant pressure on him not to give major concessions to the TPLF?
You're right. I think the first one, if we can, there's two things. One is the popular anger, resentment against the TPLF and the kind of history it represents. Mm-hmm. And the second one is more the designation as a terrorist organization. And the second one is, relatively the easiest one, because fortunately in Ethiopia, the process of designation, but also removal of the designation of an organization as a terrorist organization belongs to parliament. And so if there's political will, if there's acceptance of negotiations as the only viable way forward, they can remove the designation. So that can be done. It would be a difficult one, but it's doable because the Abiy's ruling party dominates in the national parliament. The second one is more tricky. It's very difficult because indeed the TPLF is seen as a very oppressive, exploitative Tigrayan group, right? And especially since the war started and after June, when they invaded Amhara and Afar, and they almost threatened to control Addis Ababa again. So the popular anger has exploded. So first they attacked the Northern Command, and the army is seen as the only national institution representing the country. And then subsequently, after the federal government withdrew out of Tigray, they actually even pushed forward and controlled large parts of Afar Amhara, caused a lot of damage. And so it's not just the history, but also what they did after the war started that has created a lot of resentment. At the same time, and I think this is very, very, very important, the Ethiopian people, the broader Ethiopian community and the Ethiopian government also have to recognize that the TPLF has support in Tigray. And I think we should give the people of Tigray the right to decide who represents them. And of course, the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian people also have the right to demand justice in regards to those members of the TPLF that are responsible for some of the damage, some of the destruction that and displacement that has occurred. But it's also an issue that affects Tigray. A lot of Tigrayans were killed, a lot of infrastructure in Tigray was destroyed, and therefore there has to be a way to atone for all this suffering and for all these transgressions. So there has to be a way of justice. It doesn't have to be a justice in the way we understand in the form of punishment, but we have to atone for it. We have to account for it. And so a form of truth-telling, a form of reconciliation would be critical if the country is going to go forward. But you're right, it's a very difficult one. But ultimately, we have tried war. We have been fighting for 15 months now. And I think there's a realization that whatever the Ethiopian government wants and whatever the Tigrayans want, they are very unlikely to get it through war. And therefore, sacrifice would have to be made. Sacrifice would have to be made, and this time for peace. But that would require, whatever peace process we have to pursue would require a means to atone for what happened. It doesn't have to necessarily be in the form of punishment, as we understand justice in, like with the ICC and all. But there has to be a form of truth-telling, a form of reconciliation, and also of apologies as may be needed before we can move forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that point. I mean, I think you are absolutely right. And I hope that as many of the main actors on the ground realize this as well, that a solution is not going to be reached through war. We've seen that. And I think you provided some solid evidence for that. And I also appreciate the sense of hope that you offer, in the sense that even in the seemingly intractable conflict that has produced so much tragedy, there can be an end to it, that we can see some reconciliation. I'm just partially asked this question because as a scholar based in the United States, is there anything that you see international governments, the United States being one example, but of course there's other players in this, from the European Union to China as being other kind of major international forces, United Nations, that they can do to facilitate the peace process?
Well, I think two things. First is it's very, very important that they do not jump into the categorization that, the domestic actors have an interest to call each other evil or genocideer or whatever labels, fascist or chauvinist, whatever labels that they may have. And I think it will be very cautious. International actors must be cautious not to join into these labeling and counter labeling that happens. I think that's very important. The second one is to try and understand the nuances, because the tendency of international actors, it seems to be, their sense of what is just, what is right, what is wrong, seems to look at things that happened after a particular day. So there's a short-term view, whilst Ethiopians, their sense of justice, of what, who deserves what, has a much longer time horizon, time frame. And so it's not that one side wants justice and the other doesn't. It's just the way we understand justice, the way we understand what is right and what is wrong, has a different conception, a different time frame. And therefore, I think if the international community, particularly if the West wants to really help, they should be very careful. It's a very complicated political dispute. And the violence, the crime, and all that is the consequence of the dispute. It's not the center of the dispute, and therefore, while we must call out those who are responsible, the perpetrators of the violence, and of course, any disruptions to humanitarian access, we also have to remember that these are the manifestations, these are the consequence of the problem, and not the problem itself. And if we dwell too much on those, we alienate the sides, one or the other side, and we risk hardening positions at the Ethiopian level. So it's important to focus on the manifestations, on the problems, but at the same time, it's very important to understand where these issues are from, what are the fears of the parties. There's a lot of grandstanding, a lot of positioning. But in reality, behind each positioning, there is genuine fear, genuine concern of each of these sides. So I think first, not becoming part of the, not embroiling themselves in the labeling and all of that happens at the domestic level. One, and secondly, focusing on the roots rather than just the manifestations of the problem. I think that would be critical. And of course, especially the West, unfortunately, it has taken a dual role of one punishing what they consider are perpetrators, and at the same time also trying to mediate. And these are very difficult roles to balance. And I think so far they haven't been very, very, very effective. But I think there's, now as the domestic situation, I think the realization among the domestic actors is improving. Still, it's slow, but it's still improving. The response of the Western governments also seems to be improving. And I think there's a genuine opportunity for peace now. And I am hopeful, but I think I also want to think that these are rational actors. They understand that a peace process is more likely to give them whatever it is that they want than pursuing war. And I hope that with a less accusatory and more understanding approach from the West, can push the parties towards making that jump, that difficult jump towards peace.
Are there specific maybe misconceptions that you've seen in Western media that maybe have influenced some Western governments that you would want to correct?
I think maybe two things. One is that there is a tendency to talk about a Tigrayan minority. Okay. That in reality in Ethiopia, there's no majority. Everybody is a minority.
Yeah.
So the largest group, the Oromos, are about 30-something% of the Ethiopian population. And so, they are numerically, they are smaller than the bigger groups, but everybody is a minority. I think that's very important to remember. And secondly, I think, especially the West, they need to understand the extent of anger that people, the Ethiopian people, have towards the TPLF, even before all the stuff that happened during the war. I think there is an understanding, but I don't think they understand the extent of it, the extent that the Ethiopian people dislike it. And so any judgment that considers one side as the majority, trying to attack a minority, I think that's not wrong. And secondly, any judgment that tells people that you are the bad guys, you are trying to eliminate another group, that accusatory approach is very difficult. And perhaps I think if I can say something, there's a tendency to particularly portray Amharas as the main war constituency in the country, and also spoilers of peace. Particularly after the recent gesture towards peace, there was a lot of anger among Amharas, but they are angry because they are afraid, because they are the ones that have to take, if all these gestures towards peace fails, they are the ones that primarily have to pick up the pieces. And so, understanding that fear, understanding also the history of blame and shame that they had to go through during the TPLF's dominance. Would be critical. So overall, I think the major problem, in my opinion, is that they have jumped into the bandwagon of essentially accepting one side's accusation of the other as the evil in this particular conflict, and it's more complicated than that, as all conflicts. So I think maybe I cannot put into one thing, but the overall approach should be trying to understand. That the Ethiopians are not just, they don't want to fight. They have concerns, they have fears, and rather than accusing them, trying to understand where they are coming from is more likely to lead to a fruitful outcome.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, this I think what you're saying resonates with the way that a lot of scholars have talked about the case of Sudan and South Sudan, for example, the Darfur region, where initially in the Darfur region, many activists, and this is something that's still debated, but many activists very quickly labeled this a genocide, whereas others said, though, this is a civil war that's going on. And if the international community immediately labels one group as committing a genocide, it's going to make it very difficult, to have a balanced approach. That the group that's being labeled as carrying out genocide has very little ability to compromise, very little ability to negotiate, because they have so little international support. And so I think what you're saying is that the international community has to be very careful about taking sides in those types of situations, because it can actually undermine any types of long-term negotiations. It can kind of undermine a push for peace. It can be tricky because there can also be fears of a situation like Rwanda, where the international community definitely stayed out of it too long, and things did become a very terrible genocide, very terrible situation. So it's a very complicated situation. But if I hear you correctly, it's that a great deal of care must be taken in choosing sides. And sometimes the international media, just by showing numbers of the Tigray population relative to the nation as a whole, can make it seem as if the dominant group is oppressing the minority without looking at the history, the power of the EPRDF or the TPLF within the Ethiopian context for so many years after the early 1990s.
Absolutely. As I think, you're right. Obviously, as an international community, they have to be clear in terms of when violations occur. They have to be clear in terms of the unacceptability of those measures. But if they are seen as taking sides, they must always remember, especially when you are a powerful nation as the United States, you must always remember that whatever you say affects the calculation of the parties. And for instance, I think if in June, and I think it was a massive opportunity when the federal forces withdrew, if the Western media and Western government have encouraged peace at the time, rather than trying to essentially double down on a crumbling Ethiopian force, a collapsing nation, and essentially an aggrandizing of the capabilities and all of that of the TPLF, that contributed to what I consider was a serious second miscalculation among Tigrayan forces to then invade other parts of the country. And so they must always remember that it's not just the groups that you are accusing. The other group also is taking cues, any signals, and that affects their decisions, whether they like it or not. And therefore, it's you're right, it's very difficult. And whenever you have a conflict that's so brutal, when so many people are dying, you don't want to stay quiet. It's very important, and especially in a world. And I myself studied human rights and practice human rights, so it's very difficult. But at the same time, human rights violations are the consequence of a problem. They are not the problem often, on their own, and therefore we have to be extremely cautious. And then ultimately, if we push with an accusatory tone, that can actually harden positions and lead to even more violence.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that point, and I think that you make an important insight around how this war has been extended, beginning from June 2021, where perhaps, it's hard to say in hindsight, but perhaps negotiations could have happened sooner, or peace agreement that could have happened sooner. I want to make sure that, I know I don't want to take too much of your time, but I do want to make sure that we have a chance to talk about what you mentioned before around this idea of a inclusive dialogue that the nation needs to go through, particularly in relationship to the Constitution, in relationship to ethnic federalism as well. So maybe if you could just say a little bit about your vision for how that dialogue would look, and what would ideally be the outcome of that dialogue for preventing future conflicts in Ethiopia.
First is the point of departure, and that point of departure is that there are fundamental differences in Ethiopia, and not just among political elites, but at the societal level, about first what Ethiopia was. What was Ethiopia? What kind of problems did it go through? What kind of structural faults did it have? So there's a lot of disagreement on the history of Ethiopia, and so that is very, very, very important one. Secondly, there's also a massive disagreement in terms of the institutional meaning, the institutional architecture that understanding of our history should then provide. And so we have this difference. We've had them for very long, but we never really had a chance to sit down and iron out the details and how, as a country, we should move forward. And therefore, what the national dialogue should do, and before I get there, what actually happens is that on two occasions we had a chance to address these issues. First was when Emperor Haile Selassie was removed, so we had an opportunity. But what happened was the military that took over essentially imposed its own dream, a dream that had the face and name of its time, as an Ethiopian dream. It imposed it on everyone else, and that led to conflict, throughout the entire period of the regime, and then subsequently, and then the TPLF and its allies came to power in 1991 when the Derg fell, and again they imposed their dream, their understanding of Ethiopian history, and also their dream of how Ethiopia should move forward as the Ethiopian dream in the form of the constitution. And I think at the moment now...
Sorry to interrupt, but could you just maybe say, just for, if some of our listeners are just not familiar with ethnic federalism in Ethiopia, can you just give the thumbnail or nutshell version of what it looks like?
So basically, ethnic federalism has three main features. One is that the regions are drawn along linguistic borders. And so essentially every linguistic group, at least that's the idea, every linguistic group has its own region. Now, not all the ethnic groups have their own regions, especially in the South. There's about 50-something ethnic groups that are lumped together as one. And there's a continuous demand to actually form states that are based on linguistic groups. And the Constitution also allows that.
And we saw this happen with this.
So the first, exactly. So the first feature is that fundamentally it's drawn along ethnic lines. And then secondly, and this is very important, political organizations are also organized primarily along ethnic lines. And because they are, you have political parties that are ethnicized, you have regions that are ethnicized, and then over time, these led to ethnic armies. So each of the regions essentially developed, they have the constitutional right to have their own police force, but each of them actually developed paramilitaries. They're really parallel armies that they have organized. And then also subsequently came ethnic medias. Each region has its own media. Also, the opposition from each region has its own media. So it's a combination of one, ethnic regions, and two, ethnic parties, and then flowing from that ethnic armies and ethnic media that characterizes the Ethiopian federal arrangement. And all of this is founded on the assumption that Ethiopia is composed of not individuals, but ethnic. So Ethiopia is a collection of ethnic groups. So the ethnic groups should form Ethiopia. So they are the ones that essentially agreed to form Ethiopia, rather than the people of Ethiopia or the people of the United States, as the Constitution of the United States describes. So that's, in a nutshell, how the federal arrangement is organized. And perhaps what Abiy Ahmed tried to do with the formation of the new party was change the ethnic parties into a national party, and that was obviously not acceptable. Certainly not for the TPLF. But also other key opposition groups that considered it as a departure from the ethnic nature of the Ethiopian state and more focused on the individual, which they consider as an ideological departure. So that is what in a nutshell is. But anyway, so the Ethiopian history of what Ethiopia was it a country built on individuals, or was it built along ethnic lines, linguistic lines, one? And then, however we understand that history, what kind of institutional expression should that be given? So these issues have always been there. But in the 1970s, the military regime imposed its dream on the country. In the 1991, the TPLF and some of its allies imposed their regime, their ideas on the country. Now, what the national dialogue is supposed to do is essentially go back to the drawing table and say, okay, let's talk about it. There is difference at the elite level. There's a difference at the social level. So now the idea is, okay, let's discuss what Ethiopia was, one, and two, what kind of institutional expression should that be given through the constitution, of course. And of course, one of the central contestations is, one, whether Ethiopia was a country of ethnic groups or individuals, one, and secondly, whether we should continue the ethnic federal arrangement that we currently have. And of course, the entire purpose of dialogue, at least in my opinion, is that the outcome should not be known. So no party should try and seek guarantees of what kind of outcome the dialogue should lead to. I think what should be the guarantee is that every person will have the freedom to present their ideas. Every group will have the time, the resources to try and convince other groups. And essentially, there will not be any red lines, except perhaps Ethiopia's continuity as a sovereign nation. But everything else must be, the focus should be on the process, making sure that everybody had the chance to present their ideas, to try and convince the public, but also other elites to accept their ideas. But ultimately, everybody should be ready to accept wherever the dialogue leads to. And so, the attempt to essentially ring fence before dialogue starts, what the outcome should be, it defeats the very purpose of dialogue. So essentially, what we are trying to do is, for the first time, trying to agree, or at least among a critical mass of Ethiopians, what Ethiopia was, and based on that, what kind of state it should become, and what kind of constitutional expression that should be given. These are the fundamental issues that the country would have to address through dialogue.
Yeah, and if I understand correctly, one of the advantages of that is that, in contrast to what you've described that's happened historically, where it's been a very top-down, this would be more of a grassroots expression of what governance, what ethnic relationships look like, which would give it far more legitimacy, in the sense that many people complain this is something, just the ethnic federalism structure was something that just came from the top to serve the interests of the EPRDF or the TPLF elites. Instead, you have something that kind of grows out. So even if ethnic federalism or something similar were to, maybe there wouldn't be necessarily radical changes to the ethnic federalist structure, but it would be something that was much more rooted in a popular expression of views.
Exactly. So two things. It was not just top down. It was, there was not, if there was an elite agreement, even if it was top down, at least if there was an agreement among the elites, it would have been more legitimate than the one we have. But what happened historically was it was factions of elites imposing it on everyone, and so it was not it was not just top down. It was a small faction essentially imposing its ideas. What we're trying to do now is I think it's very difficult to shake off that top-down nature, in the sense that elites will have an outsized influence in terms of framing the agenda, framing the narrative, and of course, another result also the pathway forward. And so it would be a combination. What we know is that for the first time, a variety of elites will have a say. They must be given a fair, genuine opportunity to present their ideas, to convince and be convinced, and of course compromise as may be necessary. And at the same time, also people outside the political elites will also have a say in certainly much more than before. But this is, of course, the ideal version of it, and how we're going to do it. If this process is seen by many groups as something that was just used to then justify the imposition of another hegemon's idea as Ethiopia's dream, we'll be back to square one. So we really have to genuinely accept that that process is critical. How things are done, how the agenda is set, how the deliberations happen is critical. But we must all be ready to accept where the process leads.
Is there a model that you would say that where this has happened elsewhere on the continent, in Africa, or elsewhere in the world that you might point to? Because it's clearly, I love the idea, but it also sounds somewhat abstract and challenging. Is there an example that you can point to that would maybe a direction that could, with adjustments, be followed?
Well, there are examples. I think the problems in Ethiopia are probably much deeper than any example that I can give you. But there are some examples, and some actually worked quite well. A very good example is South Africa. After the end of apartheid, there was a process where elites at the elite level had an inclusive process where they had to debate and to agree and have an understanding of the country's past. And also what kind of constitutional expression that should be given. And of course, apartheid was a big problem. But by the time that negotiation happened, there was acceptance as apartheid could not continue, right? And therefore, the tensions were a lot lower, and the stakes are a lot lower, in my opinion, compared to Ethiopia. But there was an example, and also, right to the south of Ethiopia, in Kenya in 2007, after the violence, they also understood that there was major problems. Their history is less complicated than our history, at least in terms of how we organize it. But they also understood at the time that they needed one, elite consensus, and two, popular engagement to understand what the problems were, and most importantly, to then devise a constitution that all of them can live with. And as we speak, you may know about what is happening in Chile. Chile has had a constitution that was imported by Pinochet at the end of the 1970s, and that constitution was rejected by a large group of Chilean society, mainly because it was imposed. So even if there were amendments over the years, people still wanted a break from that. And what they did a year or 2 years ago was they agreed. They sat together and agreed a new process that will then engage all the actors, all the Chilean society, and then come up with a new constitutional framework. And that Constituent Assembly that was elected to do that is actually working as we speak. Of course, dialogue has been tried. For instance, in Yemen, it didn't work. They are trying it in Syria. It's struggling to work. So it doesn't always work. But in Ethiopia at the moment, there's really no other option. I think as a country, we have to agree. We have to try and agree on something that everybody can live with, everybody can see a part of themselves. Otherwise, if we want to continue in the old way, there's one fact, and I hope that most Ethiopians also realize that at least since the 1970s, Ethiopia has been authoritarian and almost always in conflict. Right? There was a small period where there was a lull in violence, I think between 2003 or so and 2012 or 13 before Meles died. And that was because of the dominance of the ruling government. There was a complete asymmetry of power. But that is very unlikely to emerge now. And so, we can be authoritarian, but we're going to be extremely unstable. And in fact, considering the parallel armies that the country has at the moment, it could be, there could be a conflagration. It's very difficult. And therefore, I think, there's every option other than peace and dialogue is lose-lose. And I hope all the actors understand it. There's no win-lose possibility, in my opinion, in Ethiopia. And therefore, and I hope they understand this, that they will dialogue, through genuine processes, and all of them, we have tried mistrust, and that's what I always say. Ethiopian politics is organized along mistrust, and it always fails. And I think we have to give trust. If we don't give trust, we are unlikely to get it. And I really, really hope that this dialogue will be the first genuine opportunity where we give trust a chance, so that we can get out of this cycle, lose-lose cycle.
Wow. Yeah, I think that is such a important insight, really, is that the choice between trust and a continuation of violence, continuation of instability, continuation of authoritarianism. And I think the way that you present that definitely makes a powerful argument for the necessity of violence. So I really want to just thank you for your time, for sharing these ideas with us. I know that this is a challenging topic, extremely complex topic, And I appreciate your openness, your honesty, and your thoughtfulness about these issues, and also your optimism about the possibility for getting out of sustained conflict and moving towards a dialogue that perhaps can lead towards a lasting peace that then would have so many other positive implications, economic, political, social, and so many other ways, health, so many. So with that, do you have any last just parting thoughts that you would want to share with us, or anything that you would want to emphasize before we close?
Well, I want to thank you again. And you're right. I try to remain positive. I try to remain hopeful. And as they say, if you are not hopeful, you are unlikely to think about a way out. And I really, really hope that our leaders, our political leaders, those in government, those at the regional level, and on the opposition, the key opposition leaders, understand that we have tried mistrust, and the consequence, the result has always been the same. And it's time to really, really give trust a chance.
Yeah. Oh, well, okay. Thank you so much for your time, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much.